The Civil War between the Union and the Confederacy was the most costly of all American wars in terms of the loss of human life, and also the most destructive war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. The deaths of 750,000 people, a true national tragedy, constituted only part of the impact of the war on American society. Most important, the Civil War freed 4 million people from slavery, giving the nation what President Lincoln called a new birth of freedom. The war also transformed American society by accelerating industrialization and modernization in the North and destroying much of the South. These changes were so fundamental and profound that some historians refer to the Civil War as the Second American Revolution. When Lincoln took office as the first Republican president in March 1861, people wondered if he would challenge the secession of South Carolina and other states militarily. In his inaugural address, Lincoln assured Southerners that he would not interfere with slavery. At the same time, he warned no state had the right to break up the Union. Let's look at the characteristics of the South going into the Civil War. Firstly, the South was primarily agrarian, producing tobacco, sugar, and most importantly, cotton. The economic power shifted from the upper South, which would be more like Virginia, to the lower South. Remember, cotton can only grow in particular areas, and tobacco is no longer the South's major cash crop. Thirdly, cotton is king. By 1860, 5 million bales are produced per year, and it accounted for 57% of the total U.S. exports. The South was always also very slow to industrialization. They felt there was no need. The North is buying Southern cotton, and the cotton is satisfying the South's economy. They had a rudimentary financial system. This is the key to the Union's success in the Civil War. Their financial system is immature. They had basic banking and basic funding. They also had an inadequate transportation system. They did not agree with the American system. They did not buy into the American system. And so you're not going to see the amount of railroads in the South as you would see in the North. Therefore, communication is not going to be passed as readily as you would see in the North. Here's where we can look at the Southern hierarchy at the time by 1850 and even into the 1860s. The white population is made up of two areas for the most part. You have the slavocracy. These would be the plantation owners that held between 50 and 100 slaves. And then you have the plain folk, the yeoman farmers, who may have 1 or 2 slaves to assist. Then about 250,000 black freedmen, and then 3.2 million black slaves. So the total population, what we're seeing here in the South, would be about 23 million, which only makes up about 40% of the population in the United States. So the majority of the population is going to live in the North. Despite the president's message of both mediation and warning, the danger of a war breaking out was acute. Most critical was the status of 2 federal forts in states that had seceded. One of these, Fort Sumter, in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, was cut off from vital supplies and reinforcements by Southern control of the harbor. Rather than either giving up Fort Sumter or attempting to defend it, Lincoln announced he was sending provisions of food to the small federal garrison. He thus gave South Carolina the choice of either permitting the fort to hold out or opening fire. Carolina's guns thundered their reply, and thus on April 12, 1861, the war began. The attack on Fort Sumter and its capture after 2 days of incessant pounding united most Northerners behind a patriotic fight to save the Union. More than any previous president, Lincoln acted in unprecedented ways, drawing upon his powers as both chief executive and commander-in-chief, often without the authorization or approval of Congress. For example, right after the Fort Sumter crisis, he called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the insurrection in the Confederacy. He authorized spending for a war, and he suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. Since Congress was not in session, the president acted completely on his own authority. Lincoln later explained that he had to take strong measures without congressional approval. Before the attack on Fort Sumter, only 7 states of the Deep South had seceded. After it became clear that Lincoln would use troops in the crisis, 4 states of the Upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, also seceded and joined the Confederacy. The Confederates then moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia. The people of Western Virginia remained loyal to the Union, and the region became a separate state in 1863. 4 other slaveholding states might have seceded, but instead remained in the Union. The decisions of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky not to join the Confederacy was partly due to Union sentiment in those states and partly the result of shrewd federal policies. In Maryland, pro-secessionists attacked Union troops and threatened the railroad to Washington. The Union Army resorted in martial law to keep the state under federal control. In Missouri, the presence of U.S. troops prevented the pro-South elements in the state from gaining control. Although guerrilla forces sympathetic to the Confederacy were active throughout the war, in Kentucky, the state legislature voted to remain neutral in the conflict. Lincoln initially respected its neutrality and waited for the South to violate it before moving in federal troops. Keeping the border states in the Union was a primary military and political goal for Lincoln. Their loss would have increased the Confederate population by more than 50% and would have severely weakened the North's strategic position for conducting the war. Partly to avoid alienating Unionists in the border states, Lincoln rejected initial calls for the emancipation of slaves. The Confederate Constitution was modeled after the U.S. Constitution, except that it provided a single 6-year term for the president and gave the president an item veto, which is the power to veto only part of a bill. Its Constitution denied the Confederate Congress the powers to levy a protective tariff and to appropriate funds for internal improvements, but it did prohibit the foreign slave trade. President Jefferson Davis tried to increase his executive powers during the war, but Southern governors resisted attempts at centralization, some holding back troops and resources to protect their own states. At one point, Vice President Alexander H. Stephens, in defense of states' rights, even urged the secession of Georgia in response to the despotic, meaning king-like, actions of the Confederate government. The Confederacy was chronically short of money. It tried loans, income taxes, including a 10% tax in kind on farm produce, and even impressment of private property, but these revenues paid for only a small part of the war costs. The government issued more than $1 billion in paper money, so much that it caused severe inflation. By the end of the war, the value of a Confederate dollar was less than 2 cents. The Confederate Congress nationalized the railroads and encouraged industrial development. The Confederacy sustained nearly 1 million troops at its peak, but a war of attrition doomed its efforts. Take this time now to determine and research the advantages and disadvantages felt by both the North and the South. People at first expected the war to last no more than a few weeks. Lincoln called up the first volunteers for an enlistment period of only 90 days. On to Richmond was the optimistic cry, but as Americans soon learned, it would take almost 4 years of fighting before Union troops finally did march into the Confederate capital. In the first major battle of the war in July of 1861, 30,000 Federal troops marched from Washington, D.C. to attack Confederate forces positioned near Bull Run Creek in Manassas Junction, Virginia. Just as the Union forces seemed close to victory, Confederate reinforcements under General Thomas Stonewall Jackson counteracted this and sent the inexperienced Union troops in disorderly flight back to Washington. The battle ended the illusion of a short war and also promoted the myth that the rebels were invincible in battle. General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, veteran of the 1812 and Mexican Wars, devised a three-part strategy for winning a long war. One, they would use the U.S. Navy to blockade southern ports, called the Anaconda Plan, cutting off essential supplies from reaching the Confederacy. Two, they would take control of the Mississippi River, dividing the Confederacy in two. And three, raise and train an army 500,000 strong to conquer Richmond. The first two parts of the strategy proved easier to achieve than the third, but ultimately all three were important in achieving Northern victory. After the Union's defeat at Bull Run, Federal armies experienced a succession of crushing defeats as they attempted various campaigns in Virginia. Each was less successful than the one before. So let's take a look at the leaders of the Confederacy. As mentioned before, the Confederate president was Jefferson Davis, and the vice president was Alexander Stephens. Just a little bit about Davis. Davis was a Mexican War veteran. He was trained at West Point. At one point, he was Secretary of War, which was under President Pierce. He was a senator of Mississippi, so he has quite the resume. As president, he failed to reach the mark that the South was hoping for. His diplomatic efforts failed with foreign nations. He tried to take control of the military, and he failed, as mentioned before. He paid no attention to the economy, which created terrible inflation. And he was later charged with treason, but never actually tried. Let's look at the Union generals. Lincoln searches throughout the entire war to truly find the best leader, and he really doesn't find that person until Grant. So he goes through quite a few before he finds the right fit for this war. So firstly, we've already talked about Winfield Scott. He devises the Anaconda Plan, but he was seen as too old. And so the next would be Irwin McDonald. He felt the Army needed more training. He was a good planner, but he lacked logic, and he was blamed for the Battle of Bull Run. Next, we have George McClellan. He was a great organizer, and he created a confident fighting force. We're going to see him again. He leads at Antietam. We'll get back to that. Then you have Ambrose Burnside. He took over after Antietam, and he led at Fredericksburg. However, it became a terrible bloodbath. Joseph Hooker was then tried out. However, he had quite a few losses at Chancellorsville, which ended up becoming strategic for Lee. Then George Meade was chosen. George Meade saw the appointment of general as a punishment. He does win at Gettysburg, but he does not want this position. This is where we're going to see George McClellan come back again, and his plan was to capture Virginia. He was the most popular with the troops. However, he was slow, and Lincoln grows impatient with McClellan. Eventually, McClellan is going to run against Lincoln in the 1864 election. And then we finally see Ulysses S. Grant. What's interesting about Grant is that he wasn't really a person of consequence. He had poor marks at West Point. He didn't shine like his counterpart in Lee. So next, let's look at the Confederate generals. So we have Stonewall Jackson. He was extremely successful in battle. He was ruthless, but commanded an incredible amount of respect. He ends up dying at Chancellorsville, however, but he was considered Lee's right hand. Then we have George Pickett. He led at Fredericksburg and does well, but then moves on to Gettysburg and is known for Pickett's charge, which ended up being a nightmare. He ends up being let go by Lee. James Longstreet, he had difficulty leading on his own, and he opposed the attack on Gettysburg. He said it was going to be a disaster, which it ended up being for the Confederates. Then Nathan Bedford Forrest, he's the only one that's not educated at West Point. He actually entered the war as a private and moved his way up in the ranks to general by the middle of the war. He then goes on to lead the KKK later after the war ends. And then Jeb Stuart, he is going to be the one that replaces Jackson. And of course, your main general would be Robert E. Lee. Now, Robert E. Lee was actually Lincoln's first choice, but Lee wanted to see the Union stay together, but he also wanted to fight for Virginia. And so even though Lincoln offered him the command position, he is going to lead the Confederate forces. He will eventually surrender to Grant. The Union's hopes for winning the war depended upon its ability to maximize its economic and naval advantages by an effective blockade of Confederate ports, which is part of the Anaconda Plan, as mentioned before. During McClellan's Peninsula campaign, the Union's blockade strategy was placed in jeopardy by the Confederate ironclad ship, the Merrimac, a former Union ship rebuilt and renamed the Virginia, that attacked and sunk several Union wooden ships on March 8, 1862, near Hampton Roads, Virginia. The ironclad ship seemed unstoppable. However, on March 9th, the Union's own ironclad, the Monitor, engaged the Merrimac in a 5-hour duel. Although the battle ended in a draw, the Monitor prevented the Confederates' formidable new weapon from challenging the U.S. naval blockade. More broadly, the Monitor and the Merrimac marked a turning point in naval warfare, with vulnerable wooden ships being replaced by far more formidable ironclad ones. Following up his victory at Bull Run, Lee led his army across the Potomac into enemy territory in Maryland. In doing so, he hoped that a major Confederate victory in a Union state would convince Britain to give official recognition and support to the Confederacy. By this time, September 1862, Lincoln had restored McClellan to command of the Union Army. McClellan had the advantage of knowing Lee's battle plan because a copy of it had been dropped accidentally by a Confederate officer. The Union Army intercepted the invading Confederates at Antietam Creek in the Maryland town of Sharpsburg. Here, the bloodiest single day of combat in the entire war took place, a day in which more than 22,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. Unable to break through Union lines, Lee's army retreated to Virginia. Disappointed with McClellan for failing to pursue Lee's weakened and retreating army, Lincoln removed him for a final time as the Union commander. The president complained that his general had a bad case of the slows. While a draw on the battlefield, Antietam proved to be a decisive battle because the Confederates failed to get what they urgently needed: open recognition and aid from a foreign power. On the other side, Lincoln found enough encouragement in the results of Antietam to claim a Union victory. As explained later, we'll look at how Lincoln used the partial triumph of Union arms to announce plans for a direct assault on the institution of slavery. The Confederates' hopes for securing independence hinged as much on the diplomats as on soldiers. Confederate leaders fully expected that Cotton would indeed prove to be king and induce Britain or France or both to give direct aid to the war effort. Besides depending on cotton for their textile mills, wealthy British industrialists and members of the British aristocracy looked forward with pleasure to the breakup of the American democratic experiment. From the Union's point of view, it was critically important to prevent the Confederacy from gaining the foreign support and recognition that it desperately needed. Britain came close to siding with the Confederacy in late 1861 over an incident at sea. Confederate diplomats James Mason and John Slidell were traveling to England on a British steamer, the Trent, on a mission to gain recognition for their government. A Union warship stopped the British ship, removed Mason and Slidell, and brought them to the United States as prisoners of war. Britain threatened war over the incident unless the two diplomats were released. Despite intense public criticism, Lincoln gave in to British demands. Mason and Slidell were duly set free, but after again sailing for Europe, they failed to obtain full recognition of the Confederacy from either Britain or France. The Confederates were able to gain enough recognition as a belligerent to purchase warships from British shipyards. Confederate commerce raiders did serious harm to U.S. merchant ships. One of them, the Alabama, captured more than 60 vessels before being sunk off the coast of France by a Union warship. After the war, Great Britain eventually agreed to pay the United States $15.5 million for damages caused by the South's commerce raiders. The U.S. Minister to Britain, Charles Francis Adams, prevented a potentially much more serious threat. Learning that the Confederacy had arranged to purchase Laird rams, ships with iron rams, from Britain for use against the Union's naval blockade, Adams persuaded the British government to cancel the sale rather than risk war with the United States. In the end, the South's hope for European intervention was disappointed. King Cotton did not have the power to dictate another nation's foreign policy, since Europe quickly found ways of obtaining cotton from other sources. By the time shortages of southern cotton hit the British textile industry, adequate shipments of cotton began arriving from Egypt and India. Also, materials other than cotton could be used for textiles, and the woolen and linen industries were not slow to take advantage of their opportunity. Two other factors went into Britain's decision not to recognize the Confederacy. First, as mentioned, General Lee's setback at Antietam played a role. Without seeing a decisive Confederate military victory, the British government would not risk recognition. And secondly, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll talk about in a second, made the end of slavery an objective of the Union, a position that appealed strongly to Britain's working class. While conservative leaders of Britain were sympathetic to the Confederates, they could not defy the pro-Northern anti-slavery feelings of the British majority. Even though Lincoln in the 1850s spoke out against slavery as an unqualified evil, as president, he seemed hesitant to take action against slavery as advocated by many of his Republican supporters. Lincoln's concerns included 1. Keeping the support of the border states, 2. The constitutional protections of slavery, 3. The racial prejudice of many Northerners, and 4. The fear that premature action could be overturned in the next election. All of these concerns made the timing and method of ending slavery a fateful decision. Enslaved individuals were freed during the Civil War as a result of military events, governmental policy, and their own actions. Early in the war, around May 1861, Union General Benjamin Butler refused to return captured slaves to their Confederate owners, arguing that they were contraband of war. The power to seize enemy property used to wage war against the United States was the legal basis for the first Confiscation Act passed by Congress in August 1861. Soon after the passage of this act, thousands of slaves were using their feet to escape slavery by finding their way into Union camps. In July 1862, Congress passed a second Confiscation Act that freed persons enslaved by anyone engaged in rebellion against the United States. The law also empowered the president to use freed slaves in the Union Army in any capacity, including battle. By July 1862, Lincoln had already decided to use his powers as commander-in-chief of the armed forces to free all enslaved persons in the states then at war with the United States. He justified his policy as a military necessity. Lincoln delayed announcement of this policy, however, until he could win the support of conservative Northerners. At the same time, he encouraged the border states to come up with plans for emancipation with compensation to the owners. After the Battle of Antietam on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a warning that enslaved people in all states still in rebellion on January 1, 1863 would thenceforth and forever free. As promised, on the first day of the new year, 1863, the president issued his Emancipation Proclamation. After listing states from Arkansas to Virginia that were in rebellion, the proclamation stated, "I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforth shall be, free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, shall recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons." Since the president's proclamation applied only to enslaved people residing in Confederate states outside Union control, it immediately freed only about 1% of slaves. Slavery in the border states was allowed to continue. Even so, the proclamation was of major importance because it enlarged the purpose of the war. For the first time, Union armies were fighting against slavery, not merely against secession. The proclamation added weight to the Confiscation Acts increasing the number of slaves who sought freedom by fleeing to Union lines. Thus, with each advance of Northern troops into the South, abolition advanced as well. As an added blow to the Confederacy, the proclamation also authorized the use of freed slaves as Union soldiers. Suddenly, the Union Army had thousands of dedicated new recruits. Standing in the way of full emancipation were phrases in the United States Constitution that had long legitimized slavery. To free all enslaved people in the border states, the country needed to ratify a constitutional amendment. Even the abolitionists gave Lincoln credit for playing an active role in the political struggle to secure enough votes in Congress to pass the 13th Amendment. By December of 1865, the amendment abolishing slavery was ratified by the required number of states. The language of the amendment could not be simpler or clearer. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. After the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863, hundreds of thousands of Southern blacks, approximately 1/4 of the slave population, walked away from slavery to seek the protection of the approaching Union armies. Almost 200,000 African Americans, most of whom were newly freed slaves, served in the Union Army and Navy. Segregated into all-black units, such as the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, black troops performed courageously under fire and won the respect of Union white soldiers. More than 37,000 African American soldiers died in what became known as the Army of Freedom. The Battle of the Ironclads occurred at about the same time as a far bloodier encounter in western Tennessee, a Confederate state. The Union campaign for control of the Mississippi River was partly under the command of a West Point graduate, Ulysses S. Grant, who had joined up for the war after an unsuccessful civilian career. Striking south from Illinois in early 1862, Grant used a combination of gunboats and Army maneuvers to capture Fort Henry and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. These stunning victories, in which 14,000 Confederates were taken prisoner, opened up the state of Mississippi to Union attack. A few weeks later, a Confederate army under Albert Johnston surprised Grant at Shiloh, Tennessee, but the Union Army held its ground and finally forced the Confederates to retreat after terrible losses on both sides. More than 23,000 dead and wounded. Grant's drive down the Mississippi was complemented in April 1862 by the capture of New Orleans by the Union Navy under David Farragut. By early 1863, the fortunes of war were turning against the Confederates. Although General Lee started the year with another major victory at Chancellorsville, Virginia, the Confederate economy was in desperate shape as planters and farmers lost control of their slave labor force, and an increasing number of poorly provisioned soldiers were deserting from the Confederate Army. The decisive turning point in the war came in the first week of July, when the Confederacy suffered two crushing defeats in the West and the East. In the West, by the spring of 1863, Union forces controlled New Orleans as well as most of the Mississippi River and surrounding valley. Thus, the Union objective of securing complete control of the Mississippi River was close to an accomplished fact when General Grant began his siege of the heavily fortified city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Union artillery bombarded Vicksburg for 7 weeks before the Confederates finally surrendered the city and nearly 29,000 soldiers on July 4th. Federal warships now controlled the full length of the Mississippi and cut off Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the Confederacy. Meanwhile, in the East, Lee again took the offensive by leading an army into enemy territory, the Union states of Maryland and Pennsylvania. If he could either destroy the Union Army or capture a major northern city, Lee hoped to force the Union to call for peace, or at least to gain foreign intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. On July 1st, 1863, the invading Confederate Army surprised Union units at Gettysburg in southern Pennsylvania. What followed was the most crucial battle of the war and the bloodiest, with more than 50,000 casualties. Lee's assault on Union lines on the second and third days, including a famous but unsuccessful charge led by George Pickett, proved futile and destroyed a key part of the Confederate Army. What was left of Lee's forces retreated to Virginia, never to regain the offensive. Lincoln finally found a general who could fight and win. In early 1864, he brought Grant east to Virginia and made him commander of all the Union armies. Grant settled on a strategy of war by attrition. He aimed to wear down the Confederates' armies and systematically destroy their vital lines of supply. Fighting for months, Grant's Army of the Potomac suffered heavier casualties than Lee's forces in the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. But by never letting up, Grant succeeded in reducing Lee's army in each battle and forcing it into a defensive line around Richmond. In his final stage of the Civil War, the fighting foreshadowed the trench warfare that we'll see in World War I. No longer was this a war between gentlemen, but a modern total war against civilians as well as soldiers. The chief instrument of Grant's aggressive tactics for subduing the South was a hardened veteran, General William Tecumseh Sherman, leading a force of 100,000 men. Sherman set out from Chattanooga, Tennessee on a campaign of deliberate destruction that went clear across the state of Georgia and then swept north into South Carolina. Sherman was a pioneer of the tactics of total war. Marching relentlessly through Georgia, his troops destroyed everything in their path, burning cotton fields, barns, and houses, everything the enemy might use to survive. Sherman took Atlanta in September of 1864 in time to help Lincoln's prospects for re-election. He marched into Savannah in December and completed his campaign in February of 1865 by setting fire to Columbia, the capital of South Carolina and cradle of secession. Sherman's march had its intended effects, helping to break the spirit of the Confederacy and destroying its will to fight on. The effects of the Union blockade, combined with Sherman's march of destruction, spread hunger throughout much of the South in the winter of 1864 into 1865. On the battlefront in Virginia, Grant continued to outflank Lee's lines until they collapsed around Petersburg, resulting in the fall of Richmond on April 3rd, 1865. Everyone knew that the end was near. The Confederate government tried to negotiate for peace, but Lincoln would accept nothing short of restoration of the Union, and Jefferson Davis still demanded nothing less than independence.
Lee retreated from Richmond with an army of less than 30,000 men. He tried to escape to the mountains, only to be cut off and forced to surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The Union general treated his longtime enemy with respect and allowed Lee's men to return to their homes with their horses. Only a month before Lee's surrender, Lincoln delivered one of his greatest speeches, the second inaugural address. He urged that the defeated South be treated benevolently, with malice towards none, with charity for all. On April 14th, John Wilkes Booth, an embittered actor and Confederate sympathizer, shot and killed the president while he was attending a performance in Ford's Theater in Washington. On the same night, a co-conspirator attacked but only wounded Secretary of State William Seward. These shocking events aroused the fury of Northerners at the very time that the Confederates most needed sympathetic hearing. The loss of Lincoln's leadership was widely mourned, but the extent of the loss was not fully appreciated until two sections of a reunited country had to cope with the overwhelming problems of post-war reconstruction. Both during the war and in the years that followed, American society underwent deep and sometimes wrenching changes. The electoral process continued during the war with surprisingly few restrictions. Secession of the southern states had created Republican majorities in both houses of Congress. Within Republican ranks, however, there were sharp differences between the radical faction and the moderate faction. The radical faction would be those who campaigned the cause of immediate abolition of slavery, and those who would be the moderate faction would be free soilers. Most Democrats supported the war but criticized Lincoln's conduct of it. Peace Democrats and Copperheads opposed the war and wanted to negotiate peace. The most notorious Copperhead, Congressman Clement L. Vandelham of Ohio, was briefly banished from the United States to Canada for his treasonable pro-Confederacy speeches against the war. When the war began in 1861, those who fought were volunteers. However, as the need for replacements became acute, both the Union and the Confederacy resorted to laws for conscription or drafting men into service. The Union's first Conscription Act, adopted in March 1863, made all men between the ages of 20 and 45 liable for military service, but allowed a draftee to avoid service by either finding a substitute to serve or paying a $300 exemption fee. The law provoked fierce opposition among poor laborers who feared that if and when they returned to civilian life, their jobs would be taken by freed African Americans. In July 1863, riots against the draft erupted in New York City, in which a mostly Irish American mob attacked blacks and wealthy whites. Some 117 people were killed before federal troops and a temporary suspension of the draft restored order. The suspension of habeas corpus and operation of the draft were only temporary. Far more important were the long-term effects of the war on the balance of power between two sectional rivals, the North and the South. With the military triumph of the Union came a new definition of the nature of the federal Union. Old arguments for nullification and secession ceased to be issues. After the Civil War, the supremacy of the federal government over the states was accepted as an established fact. Furthermore, the abolition of slavery, in addition to its importance to freed African Americans, gave new meaning and legitimacy to the concept of American democracy. In his famous Gettysburg Address of November 19, 1863, Lincoln rallied Americans to the idea that their nation was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln was probably alluding to the Emancipation Proclamation when he spoke of the war bringing a new birth of freedom. His words, and even more the abolition of slavery, advanced the cause of democratic government in the United States and inspired champions of democracy around the world. The costs of the war in both money and men were staggering and called for extraordinary measures by both the Union and Confederate legislatures. The Union financed the war chiefly by borrowing $2.6 billion obtained through the sale of government bonds. Even this amount was not enough, so Congress raised tariffs, added excise taxes, and instituted the first income tax. The U.S. Treasury also issued more than $430 million in a paper currency known as greenbacks. This paper money could not be redeemed in gold, which contributed to creeping inflation. Prices in the North rose by about 80% during the war. To manage the added revenue moving in and out of the Treasury, Congress created a national banking system in 1863. This was the first unified banking network since Andrew Jackson vetoed the recharter of the Bank of the United States in the 1830s. The war's impact on the Northern economy was dramatic. Economic historians differ on the question of whether, in the short run, the war promoted or reduced the growth of the Northern economy. On the negative side, workers' wages did not keep pace with inflation. On the other hand, there is little doubt that many aspects of a modern industrial economy were accelerated by the war. Because the war placed a premium on mass production and complex organization, it sped up the consolidation of the North's manufacturing businesses. War profiteers took advantage of the government's urgent needs for military supplies to sell poorly made goods at high prices, a problem that decreased after the federal government took control of the contract process away from the states. Fortunes made during the war produced a concentration of capital in the hands of a new class of millionaires who would finance the North's industrialization in the post-war years. Republican policies also played a major role in stimulating the economic growth of the North and the West. Taking advantage of their wartime majority in Congress, the Republicans passed an ambitious economic program that included not only a national banking system, but also the following. The first, the Morrill Tariff Act of 1861, raised tariff rates to increase revenue and protect American manufacturers. Its passage initiated a Republican program of high protective tariffs to help industrialists. Secondly, the Homestead Act of 1862 promoted settlement of the Great Plains by offering parcels of 160 acres of public land free to any person or family that farmed that land for at least 5 years. Thirdly, the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862 encouraged states to use the sale of federal land grants to maintain agricultural and technical colleges. And lastly, the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 authorized the building of a transcontinental railroad over a northern route in order to link the economies of California and the Western territories with the eastern states. Although every part of American society away from the battlefield was touched by the war, those most directly affected were women, whose labors became more burdensome, and African Americans who won emancipation. The absence of millions of men from their normal occupations in fields and factories added to the responsibilities of women in all regions. They stepped into the labor force created by the war, operating farms and plantations and taking factory jobs customarily held by men. In addition, women played a critical role as military nurses and as volunteers to the soldiers. When the war ended and the war veterans returned home, most urban women vacated their jobs in government and industry, while rural women gladly accepted male assistance on the farm. Of course, for the women whose men never returned or returned disabled, the economic struggle continued for a lifetime. The Civil War had at least two permanent effects on American women. First, the field of nursing was now open to women for the first time. Previously, hospitals employed only men as doctors and nurses. Second, the enormous responsibilities undertaken by women during the war gave way to the movement to obtain equal voting rights for women. Both in the short run and the long run, the group of American society whose lives were most profoundly changed by the Civil War were those African Americans who had been born into slavery. After the adoption of the 13th Amendment in 1865, 4 million people were freedmen and freed women. For these people and their descendants, economic hardship and political oppression would continue for generations. Even so, the end of slavery represented a monumentous death. Suddenly, slaves with no rights were protected by the U.S. Constitution with open-ended possibilities of freedom. While 4 years of nearly total war, the tragic human loss of 750,000 lives, and an estimated $15 billion in war costs and property losses had enormous effects on the nation, far greater changes were set in motion. The Civil War destroyed slavery and devastated the Southern economy, and it also acted as a catalyst to transform America into a complex, modern industrial society of capital, technology, national organizations, and large corporations. During the war, the Republicans were able to enact the pro-business Whig program that was designed to stimulate the industrial and commercial growth of the United States. The characteristics of the American democracy and its capitalist economy were strengthened by this Second American Revolution.
Now for the essential question. Why did the Union win the American Civil War? Be sure to list significant and detailed evidence.